At 22,000 feet, Lieutenant Karl Adler's engine coughed, and so did his faith in everything he'd been taught. The sky over central Germany was thin, blue, and endless, yet it felt like a trap closing in. It was March 24, 1945, and the war that had devoured Europe was collapsing from within. Below him, the once proud homeland lay shattered, cities turned to ash, rail lines torn apart, fields pocked by bomb craters. For the Luftwaffe, there was little left but duty and silence. Adler, 28 years old, had been a pilot since he was barely out of flight school. Now he was one of the last still flying, strapped inside a Messerschmitt Bf-109 that rattled like an old skeleton. The gauges danced from vibration, the canopy glass was spidered with tiny cracks, and the radio had gone dead an hour ago. He was alone, flying a plane that no longer belonged to a nation but to gravity. Then the needle on the fuel gauge hit the bottom. For a few seconds he refused to believe it, tapped the glass with his glove, hoping it was stuck. But the engine answered with a deep sputter, a cough, and a sound no pilot ever forgets. Silence. He eased the stick forward, trying to coax life back into the machine. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Dead stick. No fuel. No power. Only air. He was gliding now, and every second brought him lower over 50 miles of enemy-held ground. The war manuals had no chapter for this. His airfield lay far behind him, already in Allied hands, and the wind carried him straight toward the American lines that cut through the valleys near Kassel. He knew what happened to pilots who went down there. Everyone did. For years, the propaganda films had shown proof. Charred wrecks, parachutes riddled with bullet holes, warnings from officers that Americans shot pilots as they hung helpless in the sky. "Better to die in the cockpit," his commander once said, "than to surrender to barbarians." The words echoed now like a curse. Adler could feel the temperature drop through the thin metal skin of the plane. Frost gathered on the inside of the canopy, and his breath fogged the glass. He thought of home, his mother in Munich, his younger brother still missing on the Eastern Front, his father's empty chair at the dinner table. For a moment he wondered if they would ever know what became of him. Would there be a telegram, a rumor, or nothing at all? He looked down. The ground was a patchwork of fields and villages, roads lined with smoke trails from American convoys moving east. Somewhere down there, men he had been taught to hate were advancing toward Berlin. Men who, if they saw him bail out, might see nothing but a target. The engine coughed again, one last defiant breath, then died completely. The silence inside the cockpit was deafening. He could hear only the rush of wind past the fuselage and the rhythmic creak of the control column as he fought to keep the plane steady. Every instinct told him to jump, to pull the canopy release and trust the parachute. But his hands refused to move. He had heard stories of pilots captured alive, how they were beaten, spat on, paraded through the streets. Yet he also knew that staying in the plane meant certain death. The altimeter wound down. 20,000 feet. 19. 18. Adler whispered a prayer in German, half forgotten from his childhood, the words trembling in the cold air. He thought of the training film that had once called American pilots sky wolves. He wondered what they were really like. Somewhere above the roar of air, he heard another sound, distant at first, then closer. Engines. Fast, powerful, climbing toward him. He turned his head, scanning the blinding sky. At first he saw nothing but haze and sunlight glinting off his canopy. Then his blood ran cold. Two silver shapes emerged from the glare, sleek and gleaming, closing fast. American P-51 Mustangs, the hunters of the Western Front, the most feared fighters in Europe. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. They had seen him. They had to. He was an easy kill, a German plane gliding powerless through enemy airspace. Adler tightened his grip on the stick and braced for impact. There would be no time to bail out, no time for surrender. In a few seconds, tracers would cut through the air, and it would all be over. But as the two Mustangs drew closer, something strange happened. They did not fire. They held their formation, closing to within a few dozen yards, sunlight flashing off their polished wings. Adler squinted through the frost-clouded glass and saw, for the first time, the pilot of the lead Mustang. A young man, calm, eyes steady. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second, two soldiers separated by language, by propaganda, by everything the war had built between them. The American raised his hand and pointed, not at Adler, but downward. Adler blinked, confused. The Mustang pilot pointed again, more deliberately this time, then tilted his own wings in a slow, unmistakable gesture. "Follow me." Adler's mind reeled. Was this a trick? A cruel game before they finished him off? Or was it something else entirely? The altimeter ticked lower, 10,000 feet and falling. The fields of enemy territory stretched out beneath him like a chessboard of fate. He had minutes, maybe less, to decide. Above him, the silver fighters held position, their engines humming in perfect balance. They were close enough now that he could see the white star painted on their fuselages, the same emblem that had haunted German skies for years. And yet, they did not attack. As the sun caught their wings, they gleamed like mirrored ghosts against the winter light. In that moment, Lieutenant Karl Adler realized he was not just out of fuel. He was out of everything he understood about the enemy. Then two silver shadows filled his mirrors, closing fast. The lad Mustang edged closer until it seemed almost impossible that their wings wouldn't touch. Adler's heartbeat roared in his ears, his gloved hands trembling on the stick. Every muscle waited for the flash of gunfire. Instead, the American pilot lifted one hand from the throttle and pointed again, firmly, deliberately, toward the ground. The gesture was calm, not a threat, not mockery. The other Mustang eased in on Adler's opposite wing, forming a triangle in the air. Their engines thundered steadily, the synchronized hum of power that his own fighter no longer possessed. For a few surreal seconds, the three planes glided together through the same pocket of frozen air, one dying bird between two living ones. Adler's mind spun through every possible interpretation. Was this a tactic? Were they waiting for him to bail out so they could shoot him in his parachute, as the training films had warned? Or were they herding him toward an airfield for capture? Either way, he was trapped. He looked down and saw, far below, an airstrip marked with long white lines and American vehicles scattered along its perimeter. It must have been a captured Luftwaffe base, now wearing new colors. Smoke drifted from maintenance sheds, tiny dots of movement showing ground crews at work. The American pilot rocked his wings again, an unmistakable signal to descend. Adler hesitated. His instincts screamed no, but his options were gone. He adjusted the rudder trim and allowed the Messerschmitt to begin its slow, powerless glide downward. The Mustangs matched his every movement, one above, one beside, like silent escorts. Through the canopy he could see the lead pilot's face, barely older than his own, clean-shaven, focused, with a jawline set not in anger, but in concentration. The American's eyes met his again for a split second, and in that moment there was something almost human, an unspoken understanding that transcended the roar of engines and the language barrier between them. Adler had been taught that mercy was weakness, that the enemy was incapable of restraint. But the man flying beside him seemed to operate by an entirely different code. The altimeter wound down, 15,000 feet, then 12. Adler's palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. He imagined what awaited him below: armed guards, interrogation, humiliation. Yet the calm precision of the American formation gave him an unexpected sense of order amid chaos. They were guiding him, not hunting him. As they descended through 10,000 feet, the landscape sharpened. Fields scarred by craters, thin rivers snaking through the gray countryside, clusters of ruined houses. Every mile of it was under Allied control. The two Mustangs stayed with him, unwavering, their wingtips flashing in the sunlight. For the first time since his engine failed, Adler felt less like prey and more like a man in the hands of fate. The lead Mustang inched closer, close enough now that he could see the pilot's name scrawled in white paint beneath the canopy frame. Captain Jack Reynolds, 357th Fighter Group. The American made one last gesture, palms down, slow and steady, signaling Adler to reduce speed and prepare to land. Adler's lips moved soundlessly. He wasn't sure if he was praying or cursing. He reached for the landing gear handle, felt the stiffness of the hydraulics, and realized he would have to extend it manually. The plane shuddered as he cranked the emergency lever, metal groaning against metal. Below, the airfield grew larger, rows of American aircraft lined neatly along the tarmac. He could even make out the figures of mechanics stopping their work to stare upward at the bizarre sight. One German fighter gliding in under the escort of two American ones. If any of them chose to open fire, Adler would be finished before the wheels touched concrete. The lead Mustang pulled slightly ahead, dipping its nose toward the runway, guiding him like a shepherd dog leading a stray. The second Mustang held position behind, blocking any thought of turning away. Adler's pulse pounded in rhythm with the creaks of his dying aircraft. He kept waiting for the betrayal, for the sudden burst of tracers that would shred his fuselage and confirm everything he had believed. But it never came. Instead, the American planes seemed to slow with him, protecting his descent. Their wings rocked gently in the crosswind, as if they were urging him on, down, safely down. Adler's altimeter unwound through 5,000 feet. He could see trucks and jeeps moving on the field now, men running, some pointing, others just frozen in disbelief. His plane was losing altitude fast. Without power, he had only one chance to align with the runway. Any misjudgment, and the Bf-109 would crash nose first into the earth. The Mustang pilots seemed to understand. The lead plane broke slightly to the left, giving Adler a clear path. The second remained on his wing, close enough that Adler could read the stenciled letters near its engine cowling. Lieutenant Eddie Monroe. The two Americans exchanged a quick wing salute between them, like a signal of trust, then peeled into their final positions. Adler felt the tremor of wind buffet against his damaged plane, the weight of gravity dragging it down. The airstrip loomed large, impossibly close. His breath came shallow, controlled. He remembered his instructor's voice from years ago. A dead stick landing is a conversation between man and machine. You just pray this, machine still wants to listen. He guided the Messerschmitt toward the runway's edge, nose high, speed bleeding away. For one suspended heartbeat, he was neither falling nor flying, just existing, suspended between death and miracle. The wheels hit the concrete hard, bounced, then touched again. The aircraft rolled, shuddering violently. He had no brakes, no power, only the long, helpless glide of momentum. The plane veered slightly, metal screeching, but it held together. At the far end of the strip, the Bf-109 slowed to a crawl and finally came to rest, the propeller frozen in place like a clock hand that had run out of time. Adler sat motionless, hands locked on the stick, chest heaving. Outside, the sound of engines faded. The Mustangs soared overhead once more, circling the field, their silhouettes shining in the afternoon light, before banking away toward the horizon. For a long second, Adler wondered if he had imagined them. Then came the low rumble of jeeps racing across the tarmac. Dust rose behind their tires. American soldiers poured out, rifles ready but not raised. The nearest jeep screeched to a halt beside the battered Messerschmitt. A man in olive drab stepped out, holster on his hip, winter wind tugging at his jacket. He climbed onto the wing with practiced ease and looked down through the canopy. His voice was steady, his accent unmistakable. "Out of gas, huh?" Adler hesitated, then unlatched the canopy. The cold air hit him like a wall. The soldier, Sergeant Tom Harrison, as Adler would later learn, gestured for him to step out. "Easy, buddy," he said. "You're okay now." For a moment, Adler didn't move. The voice was not angry, not mocking, just human. Slowly, he unbuckled the harness, climbed out of the cockpit, and stood on the wing, hands raised. The wind tore at his flight suit. He expected to be shoved, to be shouted at, but instead, Harrison reached out and steadied him as he stepped down. The American's pistol remained holstered. "You hurt?" Harrison asked, searching his face. Adler shook his head, too stunned to speak. Around them, the jeeps idled, their engines rumbling softly. The war, it seemed, had paused for just a breath. Adler looked up at the sky one last time. The silver ghosts were gone, swallowed by the clouds. What had just happened defied everything he'd ever been told about mercy, about enemies, about war itself. He was alive, standing among those he'd been raised to fear, and none of it made sense. Inside the base building ahead, a new chapter waited, one that would challenge him in ways no dogfight ever could. Because the next weapon the Americans would use wasn't a gun or a bomb. It was kindness, and he wasn't ready for it. Sergeant Tom Harrison led Carl Adler across the tarmac, the winter wind howling around them, carrying the faint smell of oil, smoke, and hot engines. The airfield buzzed with motion, mechanics shouting over the roar of generators, soldiers refueling fighters, the metallic clank of tools against steel. Yet as they passed, conversation dimmed, heads turned. For the Americans, the sight was almost unbelievable. A German Messerschmitt parked intact on their runway, its pilot walking calmly beside one of their own. Harrison didn't shove or prod him, didn't bark orders or wave his pistol. He simply gestured toward a low building made of corrugated steel and said, "This way, Lieutenant." The word caught Adler off guard. Lieutenant, not prisoner, not Kraut, just a rank, spoken plainly. Inside, the room was warm, dimly lit by a coal stove and a hanging bulb that swayed gently with each gust of wind outside. The heat hit Adler like a wave after the frozen air of the cockpit. He stood uncertainly near the doorway, not knowing whether to salute, stand at attention, or drop to his knees. Harrison pointed to a chair. "Sit," he said quietly. A moment later, an officer entered, a tall man with calm eyes and the kind of authority that didn't need shouting. Captain James Whitaker introduced himself in careful German, his accent stiff but understandable. "You are Carl Adler, yes? Pilot, Luftwaffe?" Adler nodded. Whitaker gave a small smile. "Then let's start with this," he said, pulling out a metal pot and 2 cups. The rich smell of coffee filled the room, stronger than anything Adler had inhaled in months. The captain poured 2 steaming cups, then dropped 2 white cubes of sugar into Adler's. They dissolved slowly, swirling like snow in dark water. "You should drink," Whitaker said. Adler hesitated. He had imagined many first encounters with the enemy, interrogation, humiliation, perhaps even violence, but never this. His hands, still trembling, wrapped around the cup, drawing in the heat. The first sip burned his tongue, but he didn't care. It was real coffee, not the bitter substitute they brewed back home from roasted barley. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. "Why?" Adler asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Why did your pilots not shoot me down?" Whitaker regarded him for a moment, as if deciding whether to answer. Then he leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk. Because you couldn't fight back, he said simply. That's not what we do. Adler blinked, unable to respond. He had expected suspicion, not logic, contempt, not restraint. The captain continued, his tone measured and factual. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Medical attention, food, male privileges. You'll be processed and transferred to a camp in England when transport allows. You are a prisoner, yes, but not an enemy to be abused. Adler looked at him, searching for sarcasm and finding none. Whitaker reached into a drawer and placed a small notebook on the table. You may keep a diary while you're here, he said. Write what you see. It helps the mind. The gesture seemed absurd, almost insulting. Why would they give him paper and trust him with words? Yet something in the captain's voice carried the weight of genuine belief, as if decency were part of the mission. Outside, the wind rattled the tin roof, mingling with the distant hum of aircraft engines. Adler took another sip of coffee, slower this time. Each swallow melted a little of the fear lodged in his chest. He thought of the American pilot, the one with the calm eyes, who had spared him in the sky. Jack Reynolds, a name he would not forget. When Whitaker excused himself to speak with another officer, Harrison lingered by the stove, lighting a cigarette. He noticed Adler's gaze fixed on the rising smoke. You want one? Harrison asked. Adler hesitated, then nodded. The sergeant struck another match and handed him a cigarette. For a brief moment, they stood together in silence, two men bound by exhaustion more than allegiance. Harrison exhaled, his voice soft. My brother's a pilot too, he said. Somewhere over the Pacific right now. Guess you and him ain't so different. Adler didn't know how to reply. The thought unsettled him, that this man, his supposed enemy, spoke of family, fear, and fate with the same quiet weariness he felt himself. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythm oddly comforting. After a while, Harrison nodded toward a door at the far end of the room. They'll take you to the barracks soon. It's warm. You'll get a blanket and food. Don't worry. He stubbed out his cigarette and left Adler alone with his thoughts. Through the window, Adler could see his aircraft parked under guard. Mechanics were already circling it, studying the captured plane like a rare specimen. It should have filled him with dread, his secrets exposed, his machine dissected. But instead, he felt strangely detached, as if watching his former life being towed away piece by piece. The coffee cooled in his hands. He thought about what Whitaker had said. That's not what we do. What did that mean in a war that had consumed millions? Could there truly be rules, even here, at the end of everything? When the guards arrived to escort him, they did not tie his hands. One of them even offered a second cup of coffee for the road. As they walked him across the airfield toward a waiting transport truck, Adler noticed the sky glowing pink over the horizon. The Mustangs had long vanished, leaving behind only contrails dissolving in the cold. He climbed into the truck, the engine rumbling beneath him, and watched through the slats as the base receded into distance. Around him, the American soldiers spoke quietly among themselves, their words too fast for him to follow, but their tone was ordinary. No hatred, no triumph. Just another day of duty. As the vehicle jolted over the uneven road, Adler's thoughts circled back to a single realization. Perhaps the most dangerous thing in war wasn't hatred. It was kindness, because kindness forced you to see your enemy as human. He looked down at his gloved hands, still stained with oil and fear, and wondered how long that feeling would last before the world reminded him who he was supposed to be. Behind him, the airfield disappeared into the haze, and the road led west toward captivity. But for the first time since the war began, Carl Adler no longer feared what awaited him. The real battle, he sensed, would not be for his life, but for his beliefs. And that battle was only beginning. Would his faith in his own nation's stories survive what he was about to witness next? The truck carried him through the rolling hills of western Germany, past villages that were little more than ashes and chimneys. Here and there, families moved silently among the ruins, collecting firewood from collapsed roofs. The silence outside the truck was heavier than the sound of engines. To Adler, it felt like driving through the aftermath of an idea that had failed. When they reached the transfer point, an American base near the Rhine, he expected barbed wire and shouting guards. Instead, he found order and routine. The sentries saluted their officers. Vehicles were parked in neat rows. The men spoke quietly, even to him. A young private offered him water. Another checked his bandaged hand without a word. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't hatred either. Inside the intake tent, Captain James Whitaker reappeared. His tone remained professional, but there was a trace of something almost personal in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe even empathy. "You're in one piece, Lieutenant," he said in German that was smoother than before. "That's already more than most today." He motioned for Adler to sit, then poured 2 cups of coffee from a dented pot. The smell cut through the cold air. Whitaker added 2 small cubes of sugar and slid 1 cup across the table. Adler hesitated only a moment before taking it. The captain leaned back, studying him. "You look like you've had a rough week," he said. "You can rest easy now. You're our responsibility." Adler stared at the cup in his hands. He didn't know what to do with the sudden civility. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why treat me like this?" Whitaker's answer came slowly. "Because the rules matter, even when the world forgets them. You followed orders. So do we." The statement was simple, but it hit Adler harder than any interrogation could have. All his life, obedience had been the highest virtue. But this man spoke of rules as if they belonged to something higher than any flag. Whitaker filled out paperwork while Adler sat in silence, listening to the scrape of pen against paper. Outside, trucks rolled by on gravel, carrying more prisoners, men who once might have been his comrades. Some limped, others stared blankly ahead, stripped of their insignia. Whitaker closed the file and nodded toward a door. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "Clean clothes, a blanket, and food. Tomorrow, England." The guards who escorted Adler were young, barely 20, but their faces showed no contempt. One of them, a sandy-haired boy with freckles, spoke a few words of broken German. "You, pilot, yeah? Mustang better," he said with a grin. Adler almost smiled back. The room they led him to was small, with a cot, a wash basin, and a single window overlooking the compound. There were no bars, just a quiet sense of containment, not imprisonment. On the cot lay a tray, bread, canned meat, and a small bar of chocolate wrapped in silver foil. For a long time, Adler simply stared at it. Real chocolate. He had not seen any since 1942. He unwrapped it carefully, like a relic, and took a bite. It melted instantly, bittersweet and rich. In that taste was a memory of peace. His sister's laughter, his mother's kitchen, a world that felt impossibly distant. That night, Adler wrote in the small notebook Whitaker had given him. "Captured by Americans, treated not as enemy, but as man, cannot explain it." His handwriting shook as if his mind resisted the words. The next morning, Whitaker stopped by before transport. "You'll be moved to a processing camp near the coast," he said. "Devonsfield. From there, England." He paused, then added, "You'll be fine there. They follow the book to the letter." "The Geneva Convention," Adler murmured. Whitaker nodded. "Exactly. It's not propaganda here. It's practice." As Adler climbed into the convoy truck, He caught one last glimpse of the captain raising his hand in farewell. The gesture was brief but sincere. The road west wound through green valleys where spring was trying to return, timid and pale. The prisoners in the truck spoke little. One muttered that the Americans were playing a trick, softening them up before punishment. Another cursed under his breath. Adler said nothing. The coffee, the sugar, the chocolate, all of it seemed too small to matter in a war like this. Yet it gnawed at him precisely because it didn't fit the picture he'd been given. Could decency exist without motive? Could compassion serve strategy? When they reached the port, he saw lines of ships waiting under gray clouds. British and American MPs moved efficiently, guiding prisoners up gangways, offering blankets against the cold sea wind. The sight was surreal. Order in place of chaos. No shouting, no blows, only the distant echo of seagulls and boots on metal decks. As they sailed toward England, Adler stood by the railing, the waves churning white beneath him. He thought of the Mustang pilots again, Reynolds and Monroe. Their restraint had felt impossible in the moment, but now, after what he'd seen, it began to make sense. Maybe mercy wasn't a rare accident. Maybe it was policy. On the horizon, England emerged through mist. Green hills, small villages, and the faint gleam of airfields below. The ship docked at twilight, and guards led the men off in silence. The camp that awaited them was surrounded by fences, but beyond the wire were gardens, workshops, and even a soccer field. The sign on the gate read, "Devonsfield Prisoner of War Camp." The words felt both final and strangely reassuring. A guard handed Adler a wool blanket and pointed toward a long wooden barrack. "You'll get a bunk inside. Food after roll call." The tone was firm, but not cruel. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and soap. Other prisoners sat quietly, some reading, others repairing uniforms. No one spoke much, but there was no visible fear either. Adler sat on his bunk, the weight of exhaustion pressing down, yet his mind refused rest. He had survived a dead engine, enemy fighters, and the unthinkable act of mercy. Now he faced a different danger, the slow erosion of certainty. Everything he had been told about the enemy had begun to crumble. But one question haunted him more than any other. If the Americans treated their prisoners this well, was it because they were better men, or because they wanted something greater than victory? That thought lingered as the lights went out and the barrack fell silent, the hum of the distant sea whispering against the walls. Tomorrow, he would see what life inside an American-run camp truly looked like. And in that place, surrounded by those he once called enemies, Carl Adler's war with himself would begin in earnest. Would the kindness of his captors prove to be a trick, or the beginning of an answer he wasn't ready to accept? Morning came with the clang of the barrack bell and the smell of damp earth drifting in through the cracks in the wooden walls. When Adler opened his eyes, for a moment he forgot where he was. The blankets were clean, the cot firm, and outside came the muffled rhythm of men speaking English mixed with German, casual and unhurried. The war felt distant, almost imagined. He rose and followed the others into the yard. There were guards at the perimeter, but their rifles rested against their shoulders, not aimed. The prisoners lined up for roll call, their breath hanging white in the cold. Beyond the wire fence, he saw fields stretching toward the sea. The camp's sign read simply, "Devonsfield." It looked less like a prison and more like a small, self-contained town. Inside were workshops, a mess hall, a medical hut, even a small library. The first surprise came at breakfast. Oatmeal, canned fruit, and coffee poured into tin mugs. A medic made rounds checking the hands of prisoners for frostbite and infection. When he reached Adler, he frowned slightly and unwrapped the bandage on his right hand. "You've got some infection here," he said, glancing at the interpreter beside him. "We'll get you some ointment." The words were gentle, almost apologetic. Adler stared, waiting for the harsh command that never came. Instead, the medic patted his shoulder lightly before moving on. Later, Adler was assigned to light duty in the carpentry shed, repairing crates, sweeping floors, anything to keep busy. The work steadied his thoughts, and for the first time since his capture, he felt useful again. Around him, the camp seemed to run on a strange kind of discipline, firm, but not cruel. The guards enforced order without shouting. When someone broke a rule, the punishment was loss of privileges, not beatings. It was a quiet efficiency born not of fear, but of belief in structure. That afternoon, as he stacked planks against the wall, a young American guard leaned against the doorframe, smiling. "You ever play baseball, Lieutenant?" Adler looked up, puzzled. The guard laughed softly. "Don't worry, we'll teach you. You Germans can't win every game, right?" The remark was teasing, not mocking. His name was Tommy, from Nebraska, and over the next weeks, he taught Adler the basics of the sport. How to hold a bat, how to catch a ball, how to shout encouragement in English. In return, Adler taught Tommy a few words of German, most of them unprintable. They laughed together more than once, two men born on opposite sides of a war that had told them they could never share a joke. But beneath the laughter, Adler still felt unease. Part of him waited for the illusion to break, for the moment when the smiles would vanish and the cruelty he'd been warned about would finally show itself. It didn't. Days passed into weeks. The meals remained steady, the treatment consistent. The prisoners even received mail through the Red Cross. One evening, a parcel arrived with his mother's handwriting. Inside were a few photographs, folded neatly, and a note telling him that she and his sister were alive in Munich. His throat tightened as he read it. The next morning, he sought out Captain Whitaker, who now supervised the processing of new arrivals. "They told us Americans tortured prisoners," Adler said quietly. "Why do you do this instead?" Whitaker didn't look up from his clipboard. "Because someday this war will end," he replied. "And when it does, I'd rather shake a man's hand than live with what I've done to him." He signed the last form and glanced up. "Kindness isn't weakness, Lieutenant. It's strategy. We're planning for peace, not just victory." The words struck Adler harder than any interrogation could have. Strategy through decency, an idea he had never encountered. It seemed impossible that mercy could be deliberate, institutional, even ordered from the top. Yet the proof surrounded him. In the infirmary, wounded prisoners were treated by American doctors with the same care given to their own soldiers. In the kitchen, the same rations were served to guards and prisoners alike. In the recreation yard, an old gramophone played Glenn Miller records at dusk. On one such evening, Tommy found Adler sitting near the fence, listening to the swing melody floating over the camp. "You like that?" the guard asked. "Glenn Miller. He's missing now, but his music, still alive." Adler nodded slowly. "We used to listen too," he said. "Before the war, before it was forbidden." The guard smiled and turned up the volume. In the fading light, Americans and Germans alike sat outside, tapping their boots to the same rhythm. For 4 minutes, the war paused. Even the guards didn't interrupt. The music ended, and silence filled the space it left behind, an almost sacred quiet that no one dared to break. The next morning brought new arrivals. Among them was a pilot named Heinrich Bauer. His face and hands burned from escaping a wrecked plane. He came in on a stretcher, half delirious, cursing the Americans with every breath. "They'll kill us all," he muttered in German. "Don't you see? They're softening us before they strike." Adler tried to calm him, but Bauer refused to listen. Over the following days, the camp doctor tended to his wounds, changing his bandages, giving him morphine when the pain grew unbearable. A young nurse sat by his bed at night. speaking to him in broken German, telling stories of home just to keep him awake. Weeks later, Bauer could finally stand. The first thing he said to Adler was, "They're not like what we were told." The transformation was quiet but absolute. One night, sitting by the stove, Adler looked around the barracks, the men reading, writing letters, mending uniforms, and realized that something profound had happened. These prisoners no longer spoke of escape or revenge. They spoke of going home, of rebuilding, of life after the war. The hatred that had filled their lungs for years was being replaced by something fragile but alive: perspective. Devonsfield was still a prison, but it was also something more. A mirror showing them who they could become when the noise of ideology was gone. When Whitaker gathered the men for a meeting, his message was simple. "This war is almost over. When you return home, remember what you saw here. Germany will need men who can tell the difference between strength and cruelty." As the men dispersed, Adler lingered behind. The captain noticed and nodded toward the open door. "Go on, Lieutenant," he said. "You've got a letter waiting." Outside, a Red Cross officer handed him a sealed envelope bearing the official stamp of the Allied command. It informed him that hostilities were nearing an end, that repatriation might soon follow. For a long while, Adler stood beneath the cold English sky, the paper trembling in his hand. Around him, life in the camp continued as before. Orderly, respectful, quietly humane. And for the first time, he understood that this system of mercy wasn't a coincidence or an accident of good men. It was deliberate, planned, and upheld as firmly as any military doctrine. The realization unsettled him even more than capture itself. Because if mercy could be policy, then everything he had believed about strength, loyalty, and fear was a lie. He folded the letter and looked toward the horizon, where the clouds over the sea caught the last light of day. Soon he would be going home, to a country in ruins and a world he no longer understood. But before that, there was still one lesson waiting, one moment that would test everything he had learned in this camp of mercy. What would happen when mercy met memory, when the war ended, and the men who had shown compassion faced those who had not? The first rumors of surrender reached Devonsfield in early May. Guards stopped whispering when prisoners passed, but everyone could feel it. The shift in the air, the way the horizon itself seemed to exhale. Orders changed. Work hours shortened. The morning drills ceased. Then one evening, Captain Whitaker gathered the men in the yard and read from a paper trembling in his hands. "Germany has capitulated," he said quietly. "The war in Europe is over." For a moment, there was no sound. Then a single voice somewhere in the crowd began to sob, not in grief but in something deeper, something that couldn't yet be named. Freedom, guilt, loss, relief, it all blended together. Adler stood motionless, eyes unfocused. The words should have meant salvation. Instead, they felt hollow, heavy as the smoke still hanging over his homeland. Whitaker folded the paper and looked at them, his expression calm but tired. "You'll be processed for repatriation soon," he said. "But remember what you've seen here. Remember it when you rebuild." That night, Adler couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the barrack roof, replaying every moment since the day his engine died. The silence in the cockpit, the two silver Mustangs beside him, the coffee, the music, the laughter of men who should have hated him. By dawn, he realized that the war inside him wasn't ending. It was beginning anew. A week later, the first transport ships arrived to take them back across the channel. Each man received a packet of papers, a small sum of money, and a handshake from the American officers. When Adler's turn came, Whitaker extended his hand. "Take care, Lieutenant," he said. "The hardest part starts now." Adler nodded, unsure how to respond. The journey home was long and silent. Through the porthole, he watched the English coast recede and the gray waters stretch toward Europe. The sea was calm, but the men on board were restless, each one carrying ghosts of what they had done, or what they had been spared from doing. When the ship docked in Bremen, Adler stepped onto German soil that barely felt like home. His city was rubble, his house gone. His mother and sister survived in a single room above a bakery, their faces thin but eyes bright when they saw him. Yet even as they embraced him, he felt like a stranger. The words he had learned in captivity, respect, decency, restraint, didn't belong here. People spoke only of loss, vengeance, survival. He tried to explain the camp, the Americans, the music at dusk. No one wanted to hear it. The silence in those conversations cut deeper than any interrogation ever could. Over the next years, Adler rebuilt his life piece by piece. He found work helping to repair airfields for the Allied occupation forces, then for the new German government. He never forgot Whitaker's words or the quiet dignity of men like Tommy and Reynolds. The lessons of Devonsfield followed him like a compass that always pointed toward humility. In the early 1950s, Germany was rising again. Factories reopened, trains ran, children went to school under a new flag. And with that fragile rebirth came a question: what kind of men would guide the next generation? For Adler, the answer was simple. He applied for work as a commercial pilot. Flying again felt like breathing after years underwater. But this time, there were no enemies, only passengers and destinations. The cockpit became a place of peace. Still, he often thought of the two silver fighters that had spared him and the young American whose name he had seen painted under the canopy, Captain Jack Reynolds. He tried for years to find him, writing letters to veterans' organizations, Air Force archives, anyone who might know what had become of the man. Decades passed. Then, in 1989, a reply finally came. Reynolds was alive, retired in Florida. They exchanged letters first, formal, tentative, then warmer. They spoke of families, of flying, of how strange it was that the world had turned them from enemies into allies. At last, they agreed to meet. When Adler stepped off the plane in Tampa that summer, he was 72. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel. At the terminal, a tall man waited with a cane and a familiar steadiness in his eyes. Time had carved lines into his face, but the calm was the same. They approached each other without ceremony, as if resuming a conversation paused for 44 years. Reynolds smiled. "So, you made it," he said. Adler's voice broke. "You saved me. Twice." They embraced, two old pilots bound by a moment that had rewritten both their lives. Later, sitting by the runway, they watched a pair of training jets roar overhead, white trails crossing against the blue sky. Reynolds pointed upward. "NATO jets," he said. "Your country and mine, flying together." Adler nodded, unable to speak. The symmetry was almost unbearable. The same sky that had once divided them now held their grandchildren side by side. Years later, when Reynolds passed away, Adler flew to attend his funeral. He spoke softly before the crowd, telling the story of the day mercy defeated violence, of how a single decision in the sky had changed his understanding of strength. "He didn't just save my life," Adler said. "He saved what I believed about humanity." The room was silent. Even the veterans in uniform wiped their eyes. After the ceremony, Adler stood outside the chapel, watching the American flag ripple in the breeze. He realized then that the legacy of that choice, one pilot deciding not to kill, had stretched further than either of them could have imagined. It had become part of something larger, a generation learning that restraint can be power, that the real victory comes after the guns fall silent. In the years that followed, Adler's grandson became a pilot too, this time for the German Air Force, training alongside Americans under the NATO banner. When the young man earned his wings, Adler attended the ceremony. As the jets thundered overhead, he thought of Reynolds, of Whitaker, of all those who had shown him that decency can survive even in war. He felt a peace he hadn't known since that day above Castle. Looking at the sky, he whispered, "We are not enemies anymore." And somewhere in that vast blue expanse, he liked to imagine two silver ghosts still flying side by side, keeping watch over a world that had finally learned their lesson. The story of Karl Adler was not one of defeat or victory. It was the quiet proof that compassion, when practiced even once, can echo for generations. So when people asked him in his final years what he had learned from the war, he always answered the same. You can win a war by force, but you can only win peace through grace. He lived long enough to see that truth reflected in the alliances, the friendships, and the open skies that followed. And for those who listened to his story, the question lingered. In a world still divided by fear and borders, who among us would have the courage to choose mercy again when the next test comes?